Welcome to Brain Navat. And we are delighted to be rejoined by one of our favorite guests, Travis Timmerman. And we're going to have a bit of an unusual episode today in that we're going to be talking about bad philosophy. For the last 4 years, you've been treated to some of the best philosophers in the world. And now you're going to find out about the other side of it. So, Travis, would you like to start with a good thought experiment and we can use that to build on where things go wrong?
Sure. I'm happy to be here, though I don't know what it says that you went to me when you wanted an expert on bad philosophy. But let's start with a thought experiment by Derek Parfit. It's not original to him, but he is the one that popularized it and did the most work on it. And then talk about why I think that is an instance of good philosophy and how we can contrast that with bad philosophy. So, one interesting implication of standard forms of hedonistic act utilitarianism is that you could be obligated to create a world with very, very, very many beings that have lives that are barely worth living, over a world with a smaller number of very, very happy beings have some of the best lives imaginable, where the difference in the overall welfare is minuscule. Right? So imagine for a moment that you are a god and you can create a couple of different worlds. One world you could create is a world filled to the brim with suffering, where every being has a life that is just full of pain and misery. But at the same time, there's a lot of good in their life too. And it just so happens that for each of these beings, the good in their life barely outweighs the bad. So if we could assign a numerical value just for the sake of simplicity, let's suppose that there's net 1 unit of well-being for each of them, and there's tens of trillions of such beings. Or you could create a world with millions and millions of very happy people who are as cognitively sophisticated as typical human, but their lives are just near perfect, better than any of us have actually lived in the world, as good as we could possibly imagine. If this form of utilitarianism is true and you're obligated to create happy beings, then it would be wrong to create the world with very, very, very many, almost an inconceivably large number of happy people, rather than a much, much, much larger number of beings that have lives that are barely worth living. And Parfit called this the Repugnant Conclusion, and he spent a lot of time thinking about principles that would allow us, that are plausible, that would allow us to avoid the Repugnant Conclusion. Okay. Now, in spite of how well or poorly I might have described that, there's a lot of things about Parfit's work and the number of philosophers that have worked in that debate since that I think are paradigmatic examples of good philosophy. Right? So one thing is it's philosophy. That's a necessary condition for being good philosophy, is it has to actually be categorized as philosophy. But it makes a novel argument for a substantive, interesting, a surprising conclusion. This was something that philosophers had not been on their radar for thousands of years. Maybe Sidgwick got kind of close to considering these sorts of questions, but for the most part, it flew under the radar for a long time. The arguments that Parfit gives to defend principles that are going to avoid this are valid or plausibly cogent, and the premises are not obviously false. I mean, they're plausibly true. Reasonable people can disagree about it. A smart, well-informed, rational person could assent to the principles that he was appealing to that would try to avoid the repugnant conclusion. And he does so with an argumentative rigor and clarity insofar as is possible. So this is, complex, abstract stuff. It gets tricky very quickly. And it takes real skill to convey the problem, the complex problem, and the arguments surrounding that problem with maximal clarity and argumentative rigor. And sometimes those things are going to contrast with one another. They're going to be, to some degree, mutually exclusive. So you might have to sacrifice some clarity for argumentative rigor and vice versa. And he, in my opinion, manages that balance incredibly well. And then ideally, good philosophy is going to get us to the truth, even if it's only by helping us rule out false beliefs. Now, here's why I think it's worth going over that thought experiment, and here's where I want to qualify that claim. I don't think that actually succeeds on the last front. I don't think it helps us get to the truth. I think, all things considered, we should bite the bullet and say that the repugnant conclusion is repugnant in name only. It really is better, at least, even if you're not obligated. It really is better to create a world with very, very many beings that have lives that are barely worth living. And I think there's arguments we can give to say why our intuitions in these cases are not reliable. So Parfit, being the genius that he is, noticed something that almost nobody else had noticed before him. And a lot of time and energy has been spent on this project that I think is ultimately going to fail. But in spite of not meeting that condition, it's still a very good philosophy on the whole because it met the other conditions. So I think we should think of these as each condition might be not necessary for good philosophy, but they could be, with other conditions, jointly sufficient for producing good philosophy. And of course, good philosophy is going to come in degrees and bad philosophy is going to come in degrees. Okay, last thing. So that's the good. There's lots of good examples of that too. Bertrand Russell's On Denoting is a paradigmatic example. I think Holly Goldman's work on the actuals and possibles of debate, doing the best we can, is phenomenal. Judith Jarvis Thompson's A Defense of Abortion. There's just a ton of really paradigmatic examples of great philosophy. But what about bad philosophy? There's lots of examples of those too. And I think we can start to figure out how to accurately categorize them by looking at the parallels of the criteria for good philosophy. So bad philosophy still has to be philosophy, but it might fail by not making a novel argument, or it might not engage with the relevant literature, reinvent the wheel. The arguments might be obviously not sound or cogent. The premises might not be plausibly true. Right? Good philosophy can have false premises, but bad philosophy, you might be defending premises that you just can't justify. They could lack argumentative rigor or clarity, and they could mislead us or push us towards false beliefs. And again, as with the criteria for good philosophy, none of these would be maybe individually sufficient for something being bad philosophy, all things considered. But we could look at the criteria together to find, if it satisfies multiple criteria, that could be sufficient for, all things considered, bad philosophy, which will come in degrees as well.
So the area of philosophy that pops into my head first when we think about bad philosophy, and straight away here I'm going to throw a whole area of philosophy under the bus, is continental philosophy. And it's going to be hard to define continental philosophy, but it might be like porn. It might be, it when you see it. And there's a whole canon in continental philosophy that just seems particularly horrendous on a lot of these criteria. So Heidegger, for example, Derrida. There's a number of continental philosophers who are canonical to the discipline, which seem to, perhaps they're novel in the sense that no one could have written anything so horrendous before that, but they certainly are not cogent. A lot of the principles are not plausible. There's no clarity and there seems to be no rigor. What are your thoughts on continental philosophy? Do you agree with me that it's particularly horrendous?
So I agree that there's lots of work in continental philosophy that is particularly horrendous. I had read a non-trivial amount when I was doing political philosophy in the political science department, as well as philosophy in a philosophy department. I took a class on Derrida with one of the supposed world's foremost experts on Derrida. That was the worst class that I had ever taken in my life. So I think there's going to be some agreement here, but I want to qualify it in a way. One qualification is that the divide is drawn in different ways by different philosophers. And I don't think there's some uniquely correct way to draw the divide. Chris McDaniel, a philosopher at Syracuse when I was there, now he's at Notre Dame, draws it in a way that I think comes as close as many other definitions to drawing the distinction. So maybe it's worth going over that quickly for the viewers, and then I'll talk about continental philosophy I don't like, and some which I might. So he says, this is just a quote from him, analytic philosophy is a tradition that philosophers belong to in virtue of taking certain texts to be canonical, such as those of Frege, Russell, Kripke, and so on, certain patterns of citation to be mandatory, and certain aims or values as central, such as argumentative rigor, clarity, writing, and so on. So I think that does accurately describe the analytic tradition. And I think that is values that philosophers should adopt, right? So it's not just descriptively some philosophers adopt this and some don't. I think these are good ones that if you fail to adopt that, all else equal, you're going to make the work that you're doing worse. Now, Continental philosophy doesn't label a single tradition of philosophy, but as he says, rather indiscriminately groups a variety of different traditions of Western philosophy whose main commonality is that they're not the analytic tradition. Right? So since it's not a label for a single tradition of philosophy, there's not a sort of single thing that we could call Continental philosophy, but generally they do have different citation patterns. The writing style is different. From some canonical Continental philosophers, argumentative rigor is not necessarily seen as a virtue. Clarity is not seen as a virtue. Derrida was trying to push back against that, insofar as I understand, part of his project, by being deliberately obfuscatory. Now, that said, there's like the experience of reading, say, Hegel and Husserl and Heidegger and Derrida is very different from that of reading Nietzsche or Schopenhauer, who I think is exceptionally clear, or Marx and Engels. So, I have criticisms of different Continental philosophers for different reasons, but there's a large subset of Continental philosophers that I would place in the category of being like especially bad writers, displaying the vices that I think makes philosophy very worse, much, much worse than very good analytic philosophy. But I wouldn't want to paint with so broad a brush as to say that's going to include all canonical Continental philosophers.
So I remember when I was doing my postgrad in philosophy, and we had this very beautiful Norwegian girl who was in a class with us. And for the first 2 weeks, she didn't utter a word. And at some point, sort of came out that she just said, what you guys are doing is not at all what I'm used to doing. I feel completely at sea. And we realized that her background had been entirely in continental philosophy. And when she realized that the stuff that she was doing in analytic philosophy just didn't make any sense anymore, she then, went an hour up the road to the university that taught continental philosophy and was then very, very happy. And it made me think that it might be disingenuous to call the stuff philosophy. It seems that it's its own separate thing. It's often taught in English departments instead of in analytic philosophy departments. And maybe for some reason in that it has a poetic quality to it. That when people sort of read portions of it, it sounds very deep and maybe rolls off the tongue, and there's a certain kind of jargon to it, and you sound very smart. And it's not meant to invite discussion that's truth-seeking. It's meant to invite oohs and ahs. So I'll give you an example of some of this stuff. So this is a piece from Heidegger. He says, what is to be investigated is being only and nothing else. Being alone and further nothing, solely being, and beyond being nothing. What about this nothing? Does the nothing exist only because the not, in other words, the negation exists? Or is it the other way around? Does negation and the not exist only because the nothing exists? We assert the nothing is prior to the not and the negation. Where do we seek the nothing? How do we find the nothing? We know the nothing. Anxiety reveals the nothing. That for which and because of which we're anxious was really nothing. Indeed, the nothing itself as such was present. What about this nothing? The nothing itself, nothings. And I imagine if you said that around a couple of drinks, at an undergrad party, people would be like, wow, man, that's so deep. Amazing. You're so smart. What the fuck is it on about, though? It's on about nothing. And it's a bit that Carnap cites to sort of give an idea of what are the actual claims here. Let's put in a truth table. Let's see what's going on here. And he says, this is meaningless garbage. It's similar, I suppose, to what Daniel Dennett refers to as a deepity. Something that sounds really deep, man, but actually when you think about it for a little bit, you realize is either meaningless or it's saying something kind of obvious in an equivocal way. And I imagine one of the reasons why we started Brain of That was to sort of spread philosophy around to people who haven't had a genuine engagement before. So a lot of people never studied philosophy, they'll watch the show and they'll go, oh, I learned something quite cool. And unfortunately, a lot of people's first interaction with philosophy will be something like this. So they'll go to their local bookstore and they go to the philosophy section and there'll be this continental stuff that's impenetrable and it'll be a huge turnoff. The other one that I imagine a lot of people will think of as philosophy is something like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. that it's described as a philosophical novel, that there are tracts in there that seem like philosophy. They also just strike me as obscure and strange and not really truth-seeking. And the guy who wrote it was at a university, but not in any kind of recognized philosophy department. And so a lot of people's first experience with so-called philosophy is either with something that's bad or not with philosophy.
Yeah, so first, that doesn't immediately make sense to you, Mark. I'm embarrassed for you that wasn't obvious, that what Heidegger was saying. That was clear as day for me, but I'm not going to explain it uh, because that'd be beneath me. Just want to get that out there. No, okay, so let me address these in turn because I think that they're interestingly different. So one is I had tried to read a lot of Heidegger doing an undergraduate in political science and a master's, and I could not, for the life of me, no matter how hard I tried, and I did try, make heads or tails of it. Now, that might have been just a lack of my abilities at the time or abilities now. There are people like Chris McDaniel, I had mentioned, who engages with the work of Heidegger, and he will explain it, for lack of a better term, in plain English. He's got a couple of great papers in philosophy and phenomenological research where he does good history, as far as I can tell. I mean, I can't read or understand on my own to check it, but as far as I can tell, it's a good, accurate historical interpretation of what he was up to, some understanding of the claims that he might mean. In one article, he looks at potentially a triad of inconsistent claims that he was making, and then figures out how to resolve that. And I can read that and I can understand that, and I can see that there's an argument to be made that there's philosophical value there. Right. But I do think he just completely fails on the front of good philosophical writing. And when there's a danger that when somebody has a reputation for being a philosophical genius, not only the layperson, but actual professional philosophers will read them, and then they'll think, oh, well, maybe they mean A, B, C, D, E, and F. But if they're a genius, I'm going to go through the different things that they could mean, and then I'll ascribe to them the thing that I think is like the obviously best or most interesting or substantive philosophical claim. And then they get a lot of philosophical glory for that I think might be unmerited. And that happens perhaps disproportionately in the Continental tradition because the writing style of a lot of Continentals is so poor that it's just ripe for that kind of reaction. But I think it happens with some analytic philosophers too. A lot of people think Bernard Williams is a great writer as well as a great philosopher. I think he was a great philosopher, but I find his writing frustratingly unclear because there's some imprecision at certain crucial points in his work that admit of a variety of different interpretations. Paradigm example is his work on the desirability of immortality. And there's a whole subliterature now of like, well, maybe he meant this and maybe he meant this, and how can we refine his argument in various ways to get at something like really interesting and philosophically important. And then these other philosophers are doing work on behalf of him, and then he gets the kind of philosophical glory for that. He gets the credit that I think might be unmerited. So that's the first thing. Now, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is different. I haven't read it, but it's a work of fiction and it's a philosophical novel. And I've seen excerpts from it that I can't make heads or tails of. And I suspect that if I actually read the novel, I still wouldn't be able to make heads or tails of it. And then a lot of people might read that and get the impression that philosophy is asking things that have an air of paradox or they don't really make sense. And then it's sort of in the same way that you might think good works of fiction are open to a very large number of interpretations, that good philosophy is likewise saying, seemingly paradoxical, almost nonsensical claims, and then having people impose whatever meaning on it that they can do in a way that relates to their lives or that resonates with them. And I do think that is bad. Now, one thing that's interesting is that philosophical novels in general and philosophical films, they might try to be both works of philosophy and works of fiction. And something that can be a good making feature for fiction, like some sort of ambiguity in the meaning of the work, can be a bad making feature of philosophy. So I don't know if Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance succeeds as a good work of fiction. Again, I haven't read it, but there are other works of fiction that I think, oh, this is really good. This is really good making feature for the fiction, but it's going to actually make it bad philosophy. And it's pernicious consequence that some people see that. I have students that come into my class every year that sort of like, that's their impression of what philosophy is like, because that's what is called philosophy in pop culture, the pop culture that they happen to have engaged with.
I really like that distinction between something that might be a good making feature of some other area, some other discipline other than philosophy, but a bad making feature of philosophy in the very same work. I think a good example is Sartre being a nothingness. So I did a whole postgrad course on Sartre, taught by an analytic philosopher, and she taught it really well. And when she started teaching it, her name's Penny Levitt. She said one of the common mistakes that people make when they read Sartre is they assume that he's making claims that he intends to be literally true. So he describes the nature of a person as being split into an in itself and a for itself, and then he describes what the in itself does and the for itself does. And she said, well, if you understand a person in this way, it's going to give you a false account of what a person is. Or Sartre talks about the world is constructed by the for itself. So the world around a person is constructed by the for itself in the person. And she said, well, that's a form of phenomenalism or idealism that can be easily debunked. But that doesn't mean that there's no value in the work, because maybe what we need to be doing is understanding the work as metaphorical in some way, maybe as a psychological text or something similar to it, in which case it's still a bad psychological text in one way, in that it's very unclear, but it does describe some really interesting cases. So Sartre talks, for example, about the coquette who's on a date, and she, as her date that she doesn't really want to be spending time with, starts to touch her body more. He touches her hand, and his hand drifts down her leg. She escapes into the realm of ideas, and she starts talking more and more in an abstract way. And he talks about this as acting in bad faith and escaping into the for itself and leaving the in itself, which is your body, roughly translated, the body. So she doesn't acknowledge both parts of her. She just acknowledges her mind and not her body. And that does seem to capture something quite well. That captures an experience that we can have in everyday life in a very clever way. One doesn't really need this massive metaphysical framework or apparently metaphysical framework to understand that. But maybe that's the way one could understand continental philosophy, not as philosophy, but as metaphor, as an understanding of the human experience in which it is still valuable.
Yeah, that seems very plausible to me. I mean, I'd want to, again, like get into more specifics about which continental philosopher we're talking about. Like I wouldn't describe Schopenhauer that way, for instance, but I would be open to describing a lot of other continental works that way. And I'd also be open to describing that as a value of those works, irrespective of the intentions of the philosophers themselves. So even if they were taking themselves to be in the truth-seeking business and they failed spectacularly on that front, as some continental and analytic philosophers do, without question. That doesn't mean that there's not some other value that we can gauge from that. And you very nicely articulated one. Schopenhauer suggested in The World of Will and Representation that you could use his book, I think, as like a doorstop. So he saw practical value in his work as well, but perhaps more practical than the one that you listed. So there's a whole range of things that we could talk about. I mean, you might also think a lot of this stuff is historically important for various reasons, even if it fails, in the same way that, some historical films are very important, but looked through by the criteria for what makes a good film today, they fail spectacularly, but they were instrumental in the history of film as we know it, and it can be valuable for that reason. We both had talked about people who got into philosophy from engaging with it in the pop culture, and Mark, you mentioned someone that came and then left, but I have students at every university that I've been at who've come to philosophy class having a sort of confused idea of what philosophy was from their engagement with what was called philosophy in pop culture, be it Deepak Chopra or Ayn Rand or some science fiction films. And then they end up liking analytic philosophy as it's taught. They end up discovering something that was not on their radar at all, that they couldn't have even conceived of before. And that sort of bad pop culture philosophy was a necessary means to get them into the classroom and to do something that I think is, more valuable.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why we've had so many episodes on philosophical fiction is that I think that that's a good starting point to engage in genuine philosophical inquiry. That you can walk away from a film and go, wow, that was very entertaining, and I went on this emotional journey. But also, there's this question that I'm kind of now uncertain about, and I want to know more. And good analytic philosophy can start to give you some actual answers, and that's very satisfying. I think there are certain kinds of disciplines that might make people dumber, though. So I think if you go and study enough Derrida uh, and immerse yourself in that postmodern junk, you might come out a worse person. You are less clear. Your writing's unconscionably bad. You're going to be a bore at dinner parties. And you could take these promising students, throw them that stuff, and they come out the meat grinder like worse. Um, but I also have like a bit of a taste for postmodern looking cinema. So like adaptation, strikes me as one of those films that's like playing around with genre and doing the kind of postmodern moves that you see in academic literature that's kind of awful there, but it works very well in the fictional setting. Um, and that sort of playing with reference and identity and I don't know, like an author that floats and all that kind of stuff is quite fun. And so it might be that, as you say, when you stop conceiving of it as philosophy, that it still has a value of sorts, or just needs to be in the right space. I often find like there's certain artistic experiences if I go to a gallery where I walk around the work and I say this is amazing and it's has this wonderful effect on me. And as soon as I started reading the stuff that's appended to it, it ruins it. So there's some postmodern jargon, essay that's attached to it that the artist felt compelled to write, and they're like terrible philosophers. They're not good writers, but they're quite good sculptors. Um, and I often think it's probably best for artists to be focused on the making of the art as opposed to the writing of explications of the art. I went to an exhibition recently um, where someone did a real like improv theater thing where he walked up to various pieces and then just ad-libbed what they were about and used all sorts of eloquent jargon. And a lot of people were quite mesmerized. They're like, wow, this guy's a genius. This is unbelievable. And occasionally maybe there's a thing where you're fleshing something out. The artist I spoke to said, well, that's definitely not stuff I was thinking about when I made this thing, but thanks for entertaining me.
Yeah. So I was definitely dumber after I came out of that Derrida class, even knowing that it was bad philosophy. I just couldn't help but get dumber. But then there's a film called Deconstructing Harry that came out in the 90s that is supposed to be a sort of film version of a deconstruction of a text. It revolves around an author who is going to take an award, and he'd written a like slightly fictionalized account of his life and people in his life, and many of them were mad that it was so thinly veiled account of what really happened, that he was, outing their bad behavior in various ways. And like, there's lots of things about that film that make it good, that like are entirely absent in the work of Derrida. And yes, the descriptions of artwork are in museums is my favorite thing to read, actually, because they're so amazingly pretentious and often mean, as far as I can tell, like absolutely nothing. It's borderline gibberish for me, but it sounds like they're doing the most important thing in the world if you read it. And people can be taken in by that. Or maybe I just don't get art.
So why do you think people do get taken in? So Derrida's trash, Heidegger's trash. Why has that work survived? Why do they still teach it? Why do those types of descriptions on pieces of art get written and read and people repeat that process? Why is it, if it's nonsense, literally nonsense, it makes no sense, why is it that people are taken in?
Yeah, I mean, I can only make some speculative guesses here, especially with uh, descriptions of art itself. I mean, I suppose there's a certain amount of marketing that you have to do. So you'd be much more qualified to speak to this than I am, Jason. But someone wrote, like, I went to the Guggenheim recently, and there were these very cool sculptures. It was a special exhibit for an artist whose name I don't remember, uh, and it was supposed to be about infinity, and they were all the plaques were describing I, I don't know, something about engaging with the nature of infinity that made absolutely no sense to me, and which was a real shame because I'm interested in infinite ethics and the concept of infinity mathematically and so on, and it shed no light on that. What if they just wrote like, I thought this sculpture looked cool. I enjoyed the way, like, I haven't seen one that looked like this before, and I thought it looked neat. So I put it together in a couple of weeks, and I sold it to the Guggenheim for millions of dollars. Like that's not going to be as impressive to people. Why are stuff like this taught? Well, I mean, one reason might be there's a variety of non-philosophical value that could be applicable. Another competing but not necessarily inconsistent reason is that people are taken in by that because they don't see it as bad philosophy, and they might not be able to see it as bad philosophy because they don't have the requisite background in philosophical training to understand the limits of it or to subject these arguments to scrutiny in a way that would be beneficial for them. So, I mean, it's one reason that I think it'd be very valuable to teach philosophy in primary schools, because it, contrary to popular opinion, gives you a skill set that is extremely practically valuable no matter what you end up doing in your life. Because philosophical questions are going to underlie everything that we do, down to every single choice that we need to make. So having the ability to subject arguments to scrutiny, to make truth-preserving arguments, to identify fallacious arguments, to think about objections, to articulate abstract and complex ideas in a clear and concise manner, to think clearly about complex issues, that all is going to be extremely valuable no matter what career you end up choosing, no matter what you end up doing in your life. And people don't get that, so then they sort of can be easily fooled by what constitutes good philosophy. And I don't want to say this standing on a soapbox. I mean, this is my sort of personal experience as well. I never knew what philosophy was all throughout high school. And then I went to college and I thought, oh, maybe I want to go to law school. I had no idea what I wanted to do. And my advisor told me to take a logic course to hone my analytical reasoning skills for the LSAT. And that exposed me to philosophy. And then I took an intro to philosophy course and an ethics course and got hooked by it. But had it not been for that, stroke of luck, I might have just picked a major in something else and gone through life being completely unaware of what philosophy was. And I'd be, even more irrational than I am now. And I'd be worse in all sorts of ways.
So one of the other ways in which I think people do bad philosophy is they engage in a form of guru worship. So they study a great philosopher, and maybe it's even an analytic philosopher, and then they spend their time trying to unearth the meaning of the text. It's obviously easier to make an enterprise out of this when you're dealing with someone very vague. So someone like Kant, for example, there's going to be all these Kant scholars who go, well, what did Kant really mean? Because you've got the original German and you've got the translations all over the show. And so you can have this cottage industry of trying to work out what the text means. And then you can go around basically sort of saying, as a devotee of Kant, this is what you ought to do. Or when you're trying to answer a philosophical question, you say, well, I'm not sure Kant really meant that, And that seems to be doing a very different kind of exercise to what philosophers are really doing, which is to try and say, is this thing any good? Is this a good idea? Is it a bad idea? Is it true? Is it false? As opposed to, did the great author say it? Which strikes me more like a religious exercise. There's another way in which this kind of identity-based philosophy strikes me as dangerous, which is all three of us are in a Facebook group for philosophy teachers. And one of the teachers said, I would like to prescribe a set of readings that includes no white male philosophers. And this struck me as a very strange endeavor. So if you go and look at who the great philosophers are for the last 2,000 years, you're going to find that a whole bunch of them are white men, right? Not because they're white men, it just happened to be that way. So Kant, Aristotle, Mill, Rousseau, Marx, and a whole range of different ideas, they're all white, they're all men. So it might be interesting to find out what other people say. But to say that you're doing a philosophy course, that you're going to expose people to these ideas by removing people on the grounds of their race and sex, that seems to be some other kind of enterprise. It might be that there are wonderful black trans writers who are doing excellent philosophy, and you should teach them because of the content of their ideas, not because of who they like to have sex with or the color of their skin. And so I worry about going down that route when we start to prioritize ideas based on who wrote them. And I think we're starting to see some of that creep through in analytic departments when the promise of analytic philosophy has always been about, we're going to give you the best ideas by the best thinkers, regardless of their personal backgrounds.
Yes. It wouldn't be an episode of Brain in the Vat if you didn't ask me to weigh in on some controversial issue. So I don't know what that person's intent was in that post. I did see the post, of course. And I'd mentioned before, like, I think there could be good reasons for taking identity considerations into account when putting together a syllabus. But those reasons would have to not be contrary to or diminishing the value or the quality of the philosophy that's being produced. Right. So I don't know how this person was weighing these sorts of considerations, but my view is that there's so much philosophy out there, and there's so much good philosophy out there, that I could not, contrary to those rankings of the best philosophers that you mentioned, give a clear ranking of the best to the worst. I suspect that there's not even in principle a way to do that, but there's so many competing considerations and so many competing good and bad making features that, just given my own epistemic limitations, the best I could do would be to put them in like broader categories. Like, this is like really good, it's the best of the best, and then this is like, a tier below that, and this is a tier below that, and there'll be many, many tiers that range from philosophy that I think is absolutely phenomenal to work that I think is just like abysmal and like nobody should read it and it has no redeeming value whatsoever. So one thing that you could do is first just look at philosophy that's categorized at the top tier. And then if you think, oh, I don't want to make it exclusively white men, by inadvertently overlooking good works by women just because I happen to not be taught that when I was an undergrad or something like that, then you could try to find a certain number of women or people of color or whatever demographic that you want, but pick exclusively among the work that's the best of the best. You might think sometimes there's reason to teach bad philosophy. Russ Schaefer Landau's companion work to the Fundamentals of Ethics has a piece by Ayn Rand in it. I don't know why he included it, but I suspect he included it not because it's good philosophy, but because it's an idea that a lot of people, a lot of like freshman students know about. They might have some sort of superficial Andean egoism in mind. And it can be valuable to consider those ideas in a classroom and subject them to scrutiny because they're so widespread. So, I think there's different motivations for that. At the same time, that's not to disagree with the claim that like you can go way too far into identity-based politics from putting together a syllabus or anything in ways that is not going to be too conducive to the value of philosophy or to teaching in the classroom, or in ways that are going to be divisive and so on. So I don't want to say that there can't be excesses there that are inadvisable. I think they're quite clearly not only can be, but have been. And then you get that on both ends of the spectrum too.
So a category of philosophical work, if you want to call it that you raised earlier, that might be worth discussing is philosophical fiction. And if you think about science fiction, for example, which is one of my favorite areas to chat about because I'm a sci-fi author, a lot of that work fails as good philosophy. So you wouldn't call it good philosophy because it's very verbose. It tells a long story to make a short point, whereas philosophers often use thought experiments that are very brief to make the same point. So it's bad philosophy in that sense. But it's highly novel, and often philosophy is pushed forward by good science fiction, partially because of the verbosity of that science fiction, because it tells a long story, it has emotional impact, which then inspires ideas by future philosophers. And also, what you often find in very richly constructed worlds, whether the science fiction author who wrote that book or not was philosophically trained or had those philosophical questions in mind, because those worlds take some element of ours and then expand on it. They'll expand on some social feature or some technological development, and then take that to a much further degree than we have in our current world. It automatically raises questions, whether that was the intention of the author or not. So it seems like philosophical fiction might be good, not insofar as it it presents a solution to problems, unless that solution is literally uttered by the characters, and then that's usually a bad novel. So there are quite a few science fiction authors back in the 50s and 60s who would have these long philosophical discussions among characters, and it's a very unentertaining way to write science fiction. But there are a lot of science fiction novels that raise very interesting questions just because of the way the world is constructed, because some element of our current world is magnified. So I wonder, and I think what's interesting about that way of understanding those works as valuable is that it doesn't meet any of your criteria, or very few. So there's novelty, yes. There's no engagement with the literature. There's no cogency, really, because ideas are not being put together and strung together, so the inferences are not clear. Plausibility doesn't seem to be part of the criteria of a good novel. It's you're literally describing a hypothetical situation. So you're saying imagine that. You're not saying it is the case that. So plausibility doesn't really form part of the issue. It's not necessarily clear, it's not rigorous, and it doesn't aim at the truth. And yet maybe it's still philosophically valuable. So it might be a nice counterexample to your criteria for good philosophy.
Yeah, I really like that. And that could very well be true. I wonder, could something be, all things considered, bad philosophy, but also philosophically very valuable? And maybe that's where I have to go to say, like, well, I mean, I agree that it is philosophically valuable for the reasons that you gave. But nevertheless, if I'm giving an overall assessment of its quality as a work of philosophy, assuming it is a work of philosophy rather than just a work of fiction, then I would think it's overall, all things considered, bad, but nevertheless has these philosophical values that can make it worth engaging with. Make it worth engaging with, not just as a piece of fiction, but because of the philosophical value.
So, given that both of you guys are consequentialists, you might want to think about, let's say, a work that doesn't meet the criterion, but inspires a lot of people to write great philosophy. And I would think that a lot of philosophical fiction is going to fall into that category. So I'm sure there are thousands of people who went and watched The Matrix and started thinking like, whoa, man, I wonder what's really real. And then when they were hearing about brains and vats, they were like, oh, wow, it's just like The Matrix, bro. And that kind of got them into thinking about deeper questions. And so, it's launched many philosophical careers, even if itself is not very good philosophy. And there might be papers like that or novels like that as well, where there's problems, but there was something evocative, something that, stuck in people's shoe, and they sort of thought, there's a problem to be dealt with here. And maybe I want to spend more time on that problem. And so you could have, I suppose, is it good philosophy in of itself, versus did it spawn a cottage industry that's very fruitful, and because of that, it's valuable, even if it's still bad philosophy.
So, I mean, I just want to say I agree. And then on this and the thing that Jason was saying, it reminded me of Ayn Rand's Fountainhead and some of her other works. I had to read some of that as an undergraduate. And I thought that was, I mean, I think it's really bad philosophy, but what's interesting about it is I think it's bad fiction because she has characters that are obviously a mouthpiece for the philosophical views that she's trying to endorse, give bad arguments for it. But we could imagine that they were saying something true and giving good arguments for it that were interesting. I would think that might be a piece of good philosophy, this hypothetical alternative version of the Fountainhead, that argues for something reasonable rather than something dumb. But then it would make for bad fiction. But what I also am interested in is, are there cases that manage to be both? So are there cases where there's a work of fiction that there's a very clear kind of philosophical view that's being pushed in an interesting way, and it doesn't detract from like the narrative value? Or are there cases where you're giving, it's a good piece of philosophy, but maybe it works as a good piece of fiction too? So maybe Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra might be an example of that. For the former, I don't know if either of you have seen It's Such a Beautiful Day. It's one of my favorite films ever, but most people hate it. It's an animated film by Don Hertzfeldt, and it follows a stick figure, and there'll be some spoiler alerts ahead for people listening, who seemingly has been diagnosed with some brain tumor or something else that's causing very serious memory loss, and it raises a bunch of interesting questions about identity, and then the badness of death. So you see this person sort of struggling to make sense of the world, and there's a sense that his end is near. And then the culmination of the film, it ends with, uh, there's different ways to interpret it, but I think very plausibly, like on the literal reading, it turns out that he doesn't die and he becomes immortal and everyone else is mortal. And then the last like minute and a half of a film is him living through the ages as everybody around him that he's immersed his life into dies, and then all of his children die, and the human race dies, and then aliens come after him and they worship him as a god, and then they die, and then the heat death of the universe happens, and you just see him sort of like floating out in space for all of eternity. And so I think like, there's a very clear message that like immortality, at least under those conditions, would be very, very, very bad for you. And there's obviously not a direct argument given where a character states premises in an argument to conclusion, but it's you can easily infer that from what's happening in the film. And I think this is a great piece of fiction, and it's great, really fun, interesting philosophy. But I show it to my philosophy desk students every year and no one agrees with me. So it might just be my like esoteric taste, but I don't know. I'm interested in if you think there's like an example of something that is both good philosophy and good fiction in some way.
So, two examples spring to mind from the science fiction universe. The one I think exemplifies what you're talking about more clearly than the other. I'll start with the less exemplary, is probably Heinlein's work. So Heinlein wrote a lot of philosophy of politics into his work. There was a lot of discussion around legitimacy of the state, war, whether you can conscript people, and that stuff. There's long discussions among characters debating philosophy of politics, and I don't think he does a very good job there. But some of his stuff is really interesting in other areas of philosophy, like epistemology. So the idea of grokking is a really cool concept. When you grok something, you know it in a very deep way that's more than just knowledge. And that has really cottoned on in the last few years, although the notion of grokking was written in a novel by Heinlein quite a while ago, more than 50 years ago, I think. I think it was Stranger in a Strange Land is where it comes from. And yeah, it's a very cool concept that Elon Musk recently has used very often with regard to AI, where the AIs can grok things. They can know them maybe, but can they grok them? And his fiction is good fiction, despite the bad conversations. It's good fiction. Like Starship Troopers is just really entertaining and has made a good movie. Another example is Philip K. Dick's work, like Blade Runner. It was originally called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And there's just some incredibly smart philosophy in there about the notion of AI consciousness and whether it's possible for a machine to be conscious and have value, and what rights do they have. And these are really good questions, really good. And at least to my mind, it's fantastic entertainment as well. So that's an example that seems to succeed on all fronts. But like you, Travis, it succeeds for me. There's a lot of people that just hate Blade Runner, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, I suppose there's a sense in which good philosophy can inspire good filmmaking. So Tenet, which I think is probably a bit underappreciated, really does a good job on the philosophy of time and demonstrates, how these time traveling puzzles would actually work in a very visually stunning way. There is a sense in which the film is hard to appreciate if you're trying to follow the philosophical arguments while watching things kind of blow up in reverse. And is one of those things that probably rewards multiple viewings, that you can kind of have your, Hollywood popcorn, viewing, which is just, this is fun and everything is crazy. And then sitting with the spreadsheet and going, oh, wow, this is actually really, really clever and sophisticated, and I can see how this works in a certain period of time. One of our early episodes was on philosophy of time and looking at Tenet. And I suppose also so many Hollywood films that deal with things like time travel, treat it more like magic. And so the rules don't work, and it's, it's a fun exercise, but you're not kind of playing around in a possible way of understanding something like time travel. I think there's an interesting relationship between these other areas and good philosophy, and it's, I suppose you want them to be able to play with each other. I mean, one way in which fiction does a good job is that it can flesh out a world and flesh out our intuitions in a way that a paper might not be able to. Um, and I think there's some value in that. I think a lot of applied ethics is going to rely on how we feel about a situation. And if I think about when you give people a trolley problem case, they immediately go, yeah, no, pull the lever, save more lives. And then when you make it more vivid and you say, well, we're going to push this fat guy over the bridge, and the fat guy's got a family, then they start to get more and more uncomfortable. And the kinds of ethical dilemmas that you see arising in film, some of them are playing with the kinds of philosophical questions that you can see in the literature. A show like The Good Place has a whole episode on trolley problems and does a really good job of exploring philosophical ideas in a fictive realm. But sometimes you've got Hollywood rules. So it's okay to kill bad guys through summary execution if you do it in a cool way, whereas we don't think that in the real world. And so there's a sense in which you can maybe stretch our ordinary intuitions in this other realm, and the other realm lets you play in a way that you maybe couldn't in a philosophy paper.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think it's a double-edged sword, because if there's a representation of some philosophical thought experiment in fiction, and you're trying to use the thought experiment as part of a philosophical argument, it'll be easier for people who are familiar with that work of fiction to fill in all sorts of details that might have been good for the work of fiction, but not for the philosophical thought experiment itself. Or it can introduce like spurious factors that influence intuition that's not morally relevant. So I think The Good Place is an example of that. When that was airing, I had students that would, I always use the trolley problem on the first day of like an intro to ethics class to just sort of introduce a philosophical puzzle. And the students had always done this, but disproportionately they started saying things like, well, you should like sacrifice yourself to save them, and like things that are clearly ruled out by that. Or I don't think that happened in The Good Place. I think that was the Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. But there was a trolley problem there, and then she like sacrificed herself to save everybody at the end or something like that. Or like in there's versions of like that in the Dark Knight, where Heath Ledger playing the Joker. And then you might think, well, if you're maximizing the good, if you're saving the greatest number of like deserving lives or something like that, then you're playing into a madman's hands. But like, that's not part of the philosophical thought experiment in the literature, and that's just changing the view completely. In general, I think there's a danger between like somebody who knows just enough about philosophy to talk as if they're an expert. Like lots of maybe Reddit philosophers, for lack of a better term, might have like taken some undergraduate courses in philosophy, fancy themselves as philosophers, and say stuff on the internet about what philosophers thought or how to understand certain thought experiments, like what the implications of certain views are, and speak with an authority that makes it difficult for the complete layperson to distinguish between them and an actual professional philosopher that has a PhD, that writes philosophy, that publishes in journals, that studies it, extensively. And that can have I think, net negative effect in some cases. In other cases, it might have an overall positive effect by doing things like inspiring people to get into philosophy or think more critically about stuff. And it's very hard to like trace out all of the good and bad consequences that come from this. But I do want to highlight that bad one and note that, like, yeah, it's a double-edged sword here.
So I'm going to ask you a very uncomfortable question, which is to do a little bit of naming and shaming. So who are the philosophers that you've engaged with or read recently and you go, this is really bad? It's not bad for the reasons we've discussed. It's not some Continental garbage that's like obscure or impossible to read. It's someone who's in the discipline, and you read their arguments, and maybe the papers are kind of doing the rounds, or we've had them on the show, and you go, this is pretty bad.
Yeah, I mean, I never got to like engage with Foucault or Derrida. So like, yeah, I'll answer your question. Let me make some qualifications, which is I can only speak to the work that I've read, and I'm hesitant to infer from saying that a piece of work fails as a piece of philosophy that the person is a bad philosopher. Everyone, in the process of trying to be philosophers will probably do some bad philosophy. I'm sure I'm guilty of that many times over, and many people could point to all sorts of criticisms, right, good criticisms of arguments that I've made in the past, and so on. So that's the first thing. So saying that a piece of work fails is not to say that, or that it's a piece of bad philosophy is not to say that the person as a whole is necessarily a bad philosopher. But I am happy to talk about some pieces of philosophy that I do think fail. So I don't know if this is, I don't like this metaphor, but beating a dead horse, because this was a discussion on the Daily News recently. Perry Hendrick's argument with the very provocative, perhaps trolling title was something like abortion is good for Black women or something along those lines. And I had read that because I had read some of his other work on abortion, and it blew up and was being discussed in the Daily News. And I didn't want to read that discussion without having actually read the article in question. But I'd read it a little bit before that. Anyway, I think that fails as a piece of philosophy. So let me just give a quick rundown of his argument, and then I'll say why I think it fails. So what he purports to do is to argue that abortion restrictions are good for women, and in particular good for Black women, because Black women disproportionately get abortions. And the argument for that claim is, first, he's going to assume that abortion is immoral. And then he's going to try to argue in a page that it is prudentially valuable to be prevented from doing something that is wrong. So if abortion's immoral and it's always in somebody's prudential interest to be prevented from doing something that's wrong, then it would just follow that it's good for you whenever you're prevented from doing something that's wrong. Okay. Now, some people have suggested the charitable interpretation is that he is not just doing that, but trying to point to a fault in the abortion literature, where it's common to assume that abortion is permissible and then argue that abortion restrictions are bad for women. So he thinks this is a problem because it just seems to be assumed, and that his argument, his parody argument, is going to show that we must first answer the question about whether abortion is bad, like moral or immoral, before we can answer these questions about whether it's good or bad for women. Okay. So why does this fail? Well, one reason it fails, I think, is he doesn't actually establish that this is a common assumption in the literature. He cites like 3 news articles that aren't philosophical works, that aren't purporting to make any philosophical arguments. He cites one philosophical article that I went and read, and they do make an argument that abortion is morally permissible. And then they cite additional arguments that even if it's impermissible, it should be legal. And they appeal to the work that David Boonin has done. So I think that's a perfectly legitimate move. And then there's one other article that's in a bioethics journal that's by a lawyer, but not somebody that seems to have a background in philosophy, that maybe does make that assumption, or at least appeals to empirical studies to suggest that abortion is immoral. She appeals to like lots of people get abortions, so they must think it's okay. And if they think it's okay, we have empirical evidence that it's moral. That's not a good argument. But that's not establishing a pattern in the literature at all, right? You haven't even cited a single philosopher in the philosophical literature that's made that assumption. So that's one reason this fails. Another reason it fails is it's not actually a pernicious or objectionable assumption necessarily to assume the ethics of some contentious moral issue in order to talk about it. So it's perfectly fine, I think, in many contexts to say, for instance, I'm going to assume that some version of consequentialism is true, and then look at this empirical work to come to a conclusion about what consequential should say about this applied ethics literature. You don't need to rehash arguments for the permissibility or contentious philosophical views for every single article. So I actually think it's fine. Like, one, he doesn't show that people do this, and two, even if they do, he doesn't show that it's wrong or that it's like a bad move. But three, he thinks that the problem with his argument, you're going to see a parallel with this assumption. But he's assuming a very contentious claim that it's prudentially good for you to be prevented from doing something that's morally wrong. And that, I think, is false, obviously and demonstrably false. And the parallel version that he's looking at from people who assume that abortion is permissible, they're not making an obviously false presupposition. If you assume that abortion is permissible and that abortion restrictions detract from well-being in other ways by like inhibiting your autonomy or making it difficult for you to gain material wealth and so on, there's no obviously false assumption that you're smuggling it. Okay. Why I think it's obviously false? Well, he just gives an example of like somebody's driving drunk, and if you prevent them from driving drunk and they get home, that is good. You might think that it's plausibly good for them. But he spends a page on this, and there's no reason to think that it's always in one's prudential interest to be prevented from doing wrongdoing on almost any account of well-being, right? So, take hedonism as the correct account of well-being. It can obviously prevent you from maximizing your hedonic well-being to be prevented from doing something morally wrong, right? So if I steal something from you and it brings me lots of pleasure, that could make my life better for me on hedonism, and it being prevented from doing that's not going to be good for me, even if it's preventing me from doing something wrong. Take desire satisfactionism. Take an objective list theory where desire satisfaction or hedonic well-being is part of the objective list. Take a natural law view where you're doing something wrong is what you need to live, and that'll allow you to live in accordance with your nature more. I mean, on any account of well-being, I'm going to be able to construct cases where you're doing something that's unquestionably wrong, but it's going to lower your total well-being to be prevented from doing it. And everybody except Plato, and then Sergio Tenenbaum wrote a book called Appearances of the Good that tries to revive that kind of Platonism in the 2000s, I think. And that's a good book, but the argument doesn't succeed. So his argument for this claim that whether or not he's doing a parody argument, he takes this seriously. He thinks that it's true, and he thinks that he's showing a problem with the literature, and he just doesn't, in fact, do that. It's just, he has one footnote where he's like, oh, consequentialists might disagree with me, but it's not actually consequentialist. It's any account of well-being that's viable in literature. I can construct cases where being prevented from doing something morally wrong will enhance your total well-being. So that principle that he's relying on is obviously false, and there's no parallel, obviously false principle that his supposed interlocutors are assuming. Okay, now I feel like I've just sort of given an angry rant or ramble about that, but like I think those are the main problems with this. I think this is a piece of philosophy that the argument decisively fails. One last thing I'll say about that: this came up on the Daily News because someone apparently criticized this on Twitter, maybe on the basis of the title, and then looks like the journal might retract it now after having accepted it. Since you're asking me about it, I'll say I don't think that paper should have been accepted, but since it has been accepted, I think it's wrong to retract it. And even if it gets what someone might think of as the ideal outcome this time, it's going to set a precedent of journals being too conservative about controversial papers, even ones on both ends of the political spectrum. And it's going to incentivize people who disagree politically with applied ethics papers to make a big stink about it on social media, where journal editors who just don't want controversy, don't want to get sued, they'll just retract articles, even then ones that are arguing for true claims. So I don't support the retraction of the paper, even if I think it decisively fails as a piece of philosophy and should not have been accepted in the first place.
We'll be having Perry on the show, so we'll get a chance to interrogate some of the underlying arguments. And I do think the most interesting section there is the bit you've identified, which is that it's good for you to be prevented from doing bad things to others. And that strikes me as quite controversial. I'm interested to hear his views on it.
It's not even like it's controversial in a sense. But what's interesting is it's like almost any pairing of accounts of well-being and morality will generate the conclusion that it's false. So there's a like close consensus among ethicists that principle is just not true.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I think you can probably give a whole range of cases with very many viable theories that are just going to show it doesn't work. And it's one of those things that could have been defended more in the paper. Um, there's a genre of philosophy which is about being a gadfly, which is about sort of pushing strange views out there. I think the person who's probably most well known for it is a good friend of the show, Stephen Kirshner. He's infamous for arguing for positions that most people think of as being really implausible, very hard to bite. So, adult child sex being probably the most infamous example. Why slavery might be okay in certain circumstances, why it's okay to have a fetish for people based on their race, things that people find generally quite taboo. But what he does that's interesting is to try and say, let me take your common sense intuitions, and I'm going to show you based on those things that you get to this implausible case. And that's going to make you start to revise some of your other intuitions. Now, some people will accuse Steve of engaging in bad faith philosophy because he might not believe the stuff. That strikes me as kind of irrelevant. Whatever Steve believes, I think, is neither here nor there. The work must be examined on its own. And if it really is the case that common sense views lead you down dark rabbit holes, that seems like a thing worth knowing. And that strikes me as quite valuable philosophy. Although I think some people will reject it outright because of the method that he uses.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think Steve is the most well-known example of that for sure. What did Justin Weinberg at the Daily News refer to him as? Like the Kirshner cycles. Every few years, somebody will discover one of his papers. Usually, just read the title and then get quite angry about it, and then brews up a social media storm. So I mean, I think one thing to say is like it's certainly true that it's very valuable to do work that in fact shows common sense or commonly held assumptions or beliefs turn out to be in tension or lead to conclusions that are obviously absurd or pointing to an inconsistency on beliefs that people hold, and so on. So, like point out if you think utilitarianism is true and all sentient creatures have moral status, then that might, with some other empirical claims, entail that it's wrong for you to eat meat. And that's like a contradictory set of beliefs that lots of people have, and it can be very valuable to point that out. But the second thing I'd say is like, you can point that out without pretending that you in fact believe the controversial claim that's true. And here I'm not accusing Steve of doing that. I'm not accusing him of asserting claims that he believes are false. But I'm just saying in general, you could do the first thing without and also doing the second thing and pretending that like, oh, you think slavery is permissible under certain conditions or whatever the controversial question and issue is. And I think, people like Peter Singer have done this as well to great effect. And I don't think that he's arguing in bad faith. And I suspect Steve's not arguing in bad faith. And but if there are people who are doing that, then I'd say you can do this. You can do the same thing that has that value without actually the bad faith part. Does that seem right to you, or are you thinking it's sort of necessary in some way to say like I endorse this controversial conclusion rather than that there's an inconsistency or tension here among common sense beliefs?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose Steve is one of those people who's accused of endorsing the position when actually he doesn't. And I suppose if you go and read beyond the title, it's quite clear that he says, I think on the adult child sex, he says, my personal views, I find this really repugnant. But I find it quite hard to explain why it's wrong if I go and use our ordinary moral theories. And then he goes through that exercise. And that seems like he's declared his intentions up front, which align with everyone else's common sense views. And then he points out the difficulty. And then might be accused of believing the conclusion without necessarily being committed to it. But I can imagine someone who just says, look, I don't believe this thing. But wouldn't it be interesting to check and give the best possible argument I could for a view I don't believe? And I'll give you an example of someone who started off with this. Thad Metz was interested in developing an African ethic. So he's American. He's, I think, one of the most published philosophers in the world, and he's been living in South Africa for the last 25 years.
Guy writes a paper a day, it seems like.
Yeah, it's hundreds of papers. And of great quality. We've had him on the show a number of times. And he thought, look, I'm a Kantian, but wouldn't it be interesting if we could make an African moral theory that could rival the great Western theories? And so he spent decades working on this theory, not in the belief that this is actually a better theory, but just that it would be useful to go down that track. At some point, I think he took the view this actually is a superior theory. But his original intent was to sort of just have something rivaling that could be developed by others. And that seems like a perfectly good endeavor to say, I don't think this is necessarily going to be good, but let's try. Let's see what happens. And you might end up creating something that's very viable and very good or persuades other people, even if you yourself don't end up being convinced by it.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds exactly right to me. I don't know if I disagree with you about anything there. I mean, one thing that can be done at each stage, though, is to sort of say, like at this point in writing this paper, or this in this book, here's the arguments that I'm making, and here's where I stand on the issue. So I'm working on a book on the philosophy of death now, and I say, at least in the current version, the introduction, something like the first 4 chapters are ones that I'm confident enough in to say that I believe in an unqualified sense, which is unique for me for defending a philosophical position. And the last 5 chapters are ones where I think, these are interesting, viable arguments, and I probably have a higher credence in these views than many of the alternatives, but there's many alternatives. So I can't say full stop that I believe them. Right? I'd be agnostic about them, even if I'm more confident in them than others. And it might not be important for me to do that, but here's the reason I think it's important for people like Thad Metz to do that is if people take peer disagreement seriously and they don't make their intentions about where they actually stand on the argument clear, you could moderate your confidence in your views on the basis of the fact that somebody who's very smart disagrees with you, when in actuality they don't disagree with you, or the distance between you and them is much less than it appears. And you can't read all of the arguments and subject them to scrutiny yourself, or you might think even if you do that, the mere fact that there's this seemingly remaining peer disagreement means that I should be less confident in my view and more confident in their view, even if I stay confident in mine. And pretending, and I'm not accusing any specific person of doing this, but pretending that you're more confident in a view than you actually are, rather than just saying, I'm exploring arguments here, these might be viable, these might be interesting, but I don't know what to think about at the end of the day, can then prevent people from getting closer to the truth by having them adjust their credences and their views in light of peer disagreement in a way that's based on false belief about how confident this other person in fact is.
Well, Travis, absolutely wonderful having you on the show. I like the idea of doing meta-philosophy, where we can sort of think about the discipline and work out what works and what doesn't. And you've been the perfect person to have for that discussion.
Well, thank you. It's a delight and honor to be here as always. I should say there were more people that I could have gone over to pick apart philosophy that I think fails, but I only got to do one. So you should also feel free, since you're having Perry Hendricks on the show, to have him tear a piece apart of work that I want. There's no reason that he should probably want to read anything that I want to say, but he and anyone else is welcome to say why they think my own philosophical work fails.
And if you are tuning into this episode on Spotify, we have enabled a feature that allows you to send us a voice note. So let us know what you think are the worst kinds of philosophy, your favorite kinds of philosophy. We look forward to hearing from you soon.